Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. This is part two of our sort of a weekly roundup anyway, where we talk about a bunch of topics. Part one, if you haven't watched it, is kind of about Trump and the Republican Party, and we talked a lot about systemic corruption, deep corruption, not just in the Trump organization, but in that whole political stratum around the Republican Party. And we also mentioned, you have a similar thing goes on at much of the higher echelons of the corporate Democratic Party. And one of the things that I personally think is, it's not corruption because it's legal, but it's sort of borderline corruption, I think, is how so much of the funding of the Democratic Party affects the policy, particularly in its attitude towards Israel. And it goes beyond normal strategic thinking about Israel and the United States. Sometimes it goes into full prostration in front of, I think, I will use the word, I'm not a congresswoman, so no one will care what I say. But yeah, it's about the Benjamins. There's a lot of enormous funding that comes from Wall Street particularly, but also from the entertainment sector. And Chaim Saban, who you're about to see is on stage with Nancy Pelosi when she's about to prostrate herself. And Chaim Saban is one of the billionaires that's a major funder of the Democratic Party and certainly pushes the Democratic Party towards a kind of almost uncritical support for Israel. I'm not saying everyone in the Democratic Party is on that page, but much of the leadership is. Same way Sheldon Adelson pushes the Republican Party and helped finance Trump coming to power. I don't think there's any accident that Trump moved the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. That was one of the demands of Sheldon Adelson. Maybe he might have wanted to do it anyway. But to think that the money from some of these Jewish billionaires is not affecting policy is crazy. It's just fact. It's too obvious, and it's not anti-Semitic to talk about how the funding affects policy. It's no different than the Koch brothers affecting policy on fossil fuels. And anyway, here's Nancy Pelosi back in December at the Israeli-American Council. Let's run that.
If this Capitol crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain is our commitment to our aid, and I don't even call it aid, our cooperation with Israel, because that's fundamental to who we are.
If the Capitol, meaning Washington, D.C., crumbled to the ground, we would still support Israel. It's so fundamental to who we are. But I hope speaking for the Democratic Party there. At any rate, now joining me to talk about this and some other issues to do with the Democratic Party. First of all, in the studio, Jacqueline Luqman is editor-in-chief of Luqman Nation, a social media outlet, and a regular now contributor on the Real News Network.
Thanks.
And Jeff Cohen is the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and he's the co-founder of RootsAction.org. Thank you both for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff, start with you. What do you make of, what Pelosi said, which is even kind of over the line of outrageousness, even for leading Democrats. But what do you make of this deep relationship between Chaim Saban and others and the Democratic Party?
Well, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from Minnesota has been attacked for having the temerity to suggest that targeted big funding has something to do with pushing politicians to express their undying allegiance to Israel. And you just witnessed in that clip Nancy Pelosi doing it. Other leading Democrats do it. When Nancy Pelosi makes that comment, she's seated next to Chaim Saban, who has said, I have one issue. He's a big Democratic donor, one of the biggest. I have one issue, and that's protecting Israel, period. And so the lunacy of Washington is that Ilhan Omar got into trouble for saying something that everyone knows it's true. And that's that the Israel right or wrong fanaticism of the Democratic Party leadership especially is out of control, and it has something to do with the funding. Chaim Saban I think he donated about $10 million to build the offices for the Democratic National Committee in Washington, D.C.